horrible sick feeling in the pit of my stomach that perhaps I wasn't going to come back from all of this. But that was about the closest I ever came to combat.
So it must have been very difficult for you to realize this as you're... could you talk a little bit more about your experience on the truck?
I just remember the biggest problem was we didn't know what was going on. Of course, in the military you have all kinds of secrecy. And just to be called out of the barracks, we were in no condition to do any fighting. As I say, as we look back, I had no field training. We used to go out just Wednesday morning and shoot a rifle. That was about it. So we were all out of shape. Had no pre-warning that this might happen. And there were about 16 of us in the back of the truck. And what happened is you go back to all of the people back home and think about them and think that, gee, I wonder what's happening, how am I going to explain it? And then it hits you and says, well, maybe I won't have a chance to explain it. Something might happen to me. And you just have this helpless feeling that there's just no way that you're going to be able to tell anything. And then the stories come back. Having spent almost a year in the service, I met a lot of people who had been in combat. And of course you hear all the stories and all of the hardships, and as the sergeants came back from Korea on R&R, I would talk to them, and they would describe some of the terrible fighting they went through and the suffering they had in Korea, and especially during the winter when most of the troops were suffering from frostbite rather than anything else. And they would talk about the fact that they would be out there and had no idea what the enemy might be doing, and then all of a sudden they would be under bombardment, and they would see their buddies being killed. I still remember one young man who used to break down and cry because the first bombardment he was in a truck, and he was the only one who wasn't killed in that truck. And he always felt a little bit guilty that he was just wounded and he wasn't killed. So I just feel so lucky that I came close, but I never did get into combat. Made a difference.
Mm-hmm. How hard was it to adapt to the war environment?
I found it fairly easy. I guess the toughest part was that you always had to follow the Army rules and the Army way of doing it. No matter what happened. I remember in basic training, they were very careful because we were dealing with live ammunition. We were crawling under wires to simulate conditions, and we had to do everything by the book. And some people didn't like to do that. So every once in a while you'd have an accident of some kind, and somebody would get hurt, and it was because they didn't follow the rules. Now I was very, very fortunate. I guess the closest I came to any kind of injury was we came back from the firing range, and we were putting our weapons away, and there was a young soldier standing next to me, and he put the butt of his rifle up on a table, and all of a sudden it went off. And he hadn't followed the rules. We were supposed to follow the rules to make sure that your rifle or your weapon was cleared, and he didn't do it. but it was that type of thing that you always wondered, with the thousands of people around you, is everybody following the rules? Are we safe? Does everybody respect the fact that we're dealing with weapons that could kill us very, very easily? For instance, as we were practicing throwing hand grenades, we were behind a 3-foot wall, and on our side of the wall there was a pit about 6 feet deep, and if somebody dropped a live hand grenade, then the sergeant who was right next to you would just kick it into this pit, and the pit was only about 3 or 4 inches wide, and when it went off at the bottom, nobody would get hurt. But every once in a while, something like that would happen. And I remember the first time that it happened, I was really terrified when you hear that loud sound and that boot. But since I was never in field combat, the Army was fairly easy for me. As I said, I was in an office situation, and I didn't have to worry about getting out and in the field and possibly being maimed or killed.
What was your happiest memory from the war?
I would say dealing with the young kids, and they were young kids, who were drafted and had been in Korea, living in tents, living in this under terrible conditions, even though there was no combat. And when they would come back to Japan, we would get a chance to talk to them. We had a great NCO club, and it was just very gratifying to be able to sit down with them and talk about the terrible things that they were going through over in Korea. And all of a sudden say, well, I can make it a little bit easier for you by making sure that your payrolls are correct, and that you'll be able to do something to enjoy Japan.
You said NCO club. Could you explain a little bit more what that is?
In the Army, there's a distinction between commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers. And so the NCO club would be a non-commissioned officers club, and this goes up to sergeant. After that, the next promotion is lieutenant, and that's a completely different life. They are considered gentlemen under the Army code, and they are in complete charge of your life. Whatever they say, that's what you do. It's the same with the sergeant. If he gives you orders, you're supposed to carry them out, and usually you did, but you could question them a little bit. With a non-commissioned, with a commissioned officer, when he told you to do something, you just did it. And with the commissioned officer, you had to salute every time you met one. That was a little different.
Okay, how did your parents react when they found out you were going to war?
They didn't know what it really was. See, we're living in a whole different culture. I think you know what war is. You know a little bit about the military life, but in those days, people of my parents' generation had absolutely no idea what this was all about. One example is during the war, if something happened, let's say in the South Pacific, in the Mariana Islands, or maybe up in the Philippines, it would take a full week before that news would get back to the United States. And so my parents were certainly frightened of what might happen, but on a daily basis, since they didn't know about it, they went about their normal lives as much as they could. And what would happen is every once in a while, You would be walking along the street.